Out in the shadowed forests of northwestern Montana, where pine trees leaned together in huddled secrecy and the world seemed held together by silence and mist, Evan Malone lived as a ghost among the living. His small log cabin, tucked at the edge of a forgotten game trail, looked as though it might dissolve back into the woods at any moment, each board and shingle faded by rain, snow, and time. For years now, Evan had lived there alone, the scars of another life clinging to him more stubbornly than the wild mountain winter. Before Montana, there had been Iraq. Before isolation, there had been duty, fear, and the bone-deep fatigue of war. Every night, when the shadows grew long and the wind stirred the needles outside, Evan's mind returned to those blasted sands, to the faces he could never forget, and the ones he could never save. PTSD was a clinical word, insufficient for the nights spent sweating and shaking in a tangled blanket, for the guilt that wrapped itself around his throat whenever he closed his eyes. He didn't talk about it, not to the doctors at the VA, not to the neighbors he studiously avoided in the nearest town, and certainly not to the only companion he allowed near, Thunder, his Mustang. Thunder was a vision against the dull palette of the woods, his coat shimmering black, mane and tail flowing like river water at midnight. Evan had rescued him from a government roundup 2 winters back, when the world felt even smaller and more suffocating than usual. The wild stallion had nearly broken free twice, but something in Evan's manner, calm, steady, carrying its own invisible wounds, seemed to reach the horse. They became a pair, 2 creatures scarred by a world that valued neither gentleness nor wildness, existing on the thin edge between survival and surrender. Their days were measured by routine and necessity. Each morning, before the sun lifted its pale head above the distant ridges, Evan would rise and move through his chores. He'd check the old wood stove, collect water from the nearby creek, split logs for the ever-hungry fire. Thunder's breath would steam in the frigid dawn as Evan brushed him down, the Mustang's dark eyes watching every movement with uncanny intelligence. Sometimes they'd ride together, silent partners beneath the towering lodge poles. The woods were different when seen from Thunder's back, brighter somehow, with each shifting patch of sunlight or sudden burst of startled deer. Yet even in those moments, the world pressed in, reminding Evan of everything he'd lost. He avoided the town, only venturing in for necessities and always leaving before anyone could catch his gaze or try to strike up a conversation. His phone remained switched off, mail left unread. Thunder sensed it all. If Evan lingered too long in his nightmares, the Mustang would nose him gently, nickering until the man roused. Some days, when the weight of memory grew too heavy, Evan would find himself sitting in the field, hands shaking, while Thunder simply stood beside him, sharing in the silent ache. It was a bond beyond words, forged in shared solitude and mutual survival. Sometimes Evan wondered if Thunder, too, dreamed of the wild herds he'd left behind, or if the horse could sense the storm always lurking in Evan's mind. Occasionally, the forest would erupt in a flurry of wings or the sharp snap of a twig, and Thunder would freeze, ears pricked, before Evan even registered the threat. The Mustang's vigilance reassured him in a way nothing else could. With Thunder, he felt seen, known in a way that didn't require explanation or apology. The outside world intruded only rarely. A hunter's distant gunshot, the far-off growl of a truck engine, the brief glimpse of hikers wandering lost on the wrong trail. When such things happened, Evan would retreat deeper, following Thunder along paths only animals seemed to know, and wait until the danger passed. He kept to himself, not out of misanthropy, but necessity. He'd seen what happened when people brought their pain to others, how it rippled, fractured, sometimes broke what little hope remained. At night, the nightmares came. Images stuttered through Evan's mind. The sound of mortar fire, the scent of burning oil, the echo of a friend's final scream. Sometimes he woke gasping, tangled in sweat-drenched sheets, with thunder standing at the foot of the bed, head cocked in silent concern. It was in these moments, more than any other, that Evan felt both the depth of his isolation and the fragile comfort of the Mustang's presence. Yet there were cracks in his self-imposed exile, moments when the old Evan, brighter, younger, still whole, seemed to flicker back to life. When thunder would gallop through the field, mane whipping in the wind, Evan felt something stir in his chest. When sunlight filtered through the trees and painted everything gold, he could almost, for a heartbeat, forget what haunted him. But the guilt always returned, cold, sharp, inexorable. It reminded him that he had not come to the forest to heal, but to disappear. He had failed in ways too numerous to count, and the only way he knew to atone was to stay invisible, to harm no one, to be a burden to none. On a day much like any other, as the seasons inched from fall toward winter and the first hints of snow tinged the air, Evan's carefully built routine teetered on the edge of change. Something was about to disrupt the haunted peace he and Thunder had constructed, a secret waiting in the bones of the old cabin, in the buried past of a family and a land not yet finished with him. But for now, Evan moved through the gray light, alone but not unloved, silent but never truly unheard. And somewhere in the darkness, Thunder waited, the keeper of Evan's secrets and the only witness to a haunted existence not yet ready to end. A week slipped by in the hush of the woods. The seasons were turning, frost creeping onto the grass each morning, nights growing longer and edged with the promise of snow. Evan's routine was as rigid as ever, yet some invisible tension had started to gather around the cabin, an itch beneath the skin, a sense that something, somewhere, was waiting for him to notice. It was a chore that forced change. One morning, while checking for drafts, Evan noticed a loose board near the hearth. He crouched down, fingertips running over the warped wood, frowning at the way it shifted under the slightest pressure. The old cabin, built decades before his time, was full of quirks and secrets. He'd learned that much since inheriting it from his late father, who'd spoken little about the place except that it was Malone land, and that's all you need to know. He fetched a crowbar, pried at the stubborn plank until it finally lifted with a splintering creak. A waft of cold, dry air breathed up from the darkness beneath. Evan hesitated, heart thumping, not from fear of animals or rot, but from the uncanny feeling of being watched, as if the past itself had stirred. Thunder, who'd been standing at the doorway, gave a low nicker and pawed the ground. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring at the scent rising from the open space. Evan lowered a flashlight and caught a glint of metal and leather. He reached down, hands brushing dust and brittle cobwebs, and hauled out a battered trunk. The old case was heavy, the leather straps worn and nearly fused with age, but the brass latches still worked. For a moment, Evan just stared, wondering how many years it had lain undisturbed while generations passed above it. He set it by the hearth and knelt beside it, Thunder's dark eyes fixed on every movement. Evan undid the buckles, his pulse unsteady. The lid creaked open to reveal a time capsule of another era, a faded canvas pouch, a bundle of yellowed papers, and a thick journal bound in cracked leather. There was also a folded piece of oilskin, inside which rested a strange assortment of tokens, old coins, a few arrowheads, a brass button from a soldier's uniform. The scent of old leather and ink flooded the cabin, mingling with the sharper tang of dust and history. Thunder approached, lowering his head to sniff at the edge of the trunk. As Evan lifted the journal, the Mustang pawed at the wood, then recoiled, as if recognizing something both strange and familiar. It was an odd reaction. Thunder was usually unflappable, yet now he snorted and shook his mane, almost urging Evan to look deeper. Turning the first page, Evan read the name written in careful script: Samuel Malone, his grandfather. He remembered Samuel only from stories, tough as nails, a man who fought in the Pacific and later in forgotten wars at home, a man who never quite fit anywhere after he came back. The entries began with matter-of-fact accounts of ranch life, but soon shifted, growing darker. Samuel wrote of his guilt and shame, his regret over a chapter long hidden from the family, the forced displacement of a local native tribe, and his role, however unwilling, in their heartbreak. Evan sat back on his heels, the weight of it settling over him. The journal was filled with confessions, tales of sleepless nights, and a recurring nightmare that echoed Evan's own. There were sketches, too, rough maps of the forest, a drawing of a waterfall, and strange symbols he didn't recognize. He traced his finger over the ink, feeling the pull of something both ancient and unresolved. Among the pages, a faded map slipped out, its corners brittle but the markings still clear. Rivers, peaks, and a spot marked with an X near what looked like a waterfall. There were notes scrawled beside it. Hidden beneath the falls, return what was lost, make amends. Evan's hands shook slightly as he held the map up to the light, piecing together fragments of a secret too heavy for any one man to carry. Thunder, still restless, began to paw again at the trunk, snorting as if to prod Evan onward. The Mustang's unease unsettled him, but it was also strangely reassuring. He wasn't alone in feeling the air grow charged with the weight of old sins and unfinished business. Evan tried to push it away, telling himself it was nothing, just an old man's ramblings, a family legend, but the words in the journal wouldn't let go. Night fell early that day, thick clouds blotting out the moon, the wind moaning through the cracks in the logs. Evan sat by the fire, journal open on his knees, the map unfolded beside him. The room felt crowded, as if ghosts lingered in every shadow. He debated whether to close the trunk and hide it back beneath the floor, to let the past stay buried. But every time he looked at Thunder, alert, watching, waiting, he sensed a challenge. The Mustang seemed to demand more from him than silence and retreat. Evan's eyes lingered on the journal's final pages, where Samuel had written a desperate plea for forgiveness, not just for himself, but for the family, for the land, for the tribes who had lost so much. The last words were smudged by water or tears. If you find this, do what's right. End what I could not. Unable to resist, Evan found himself drawn to the map again, to the X near the waterfall, to the sense of destiny gnawing at his heart. Thunder nickered softly, bumping Evan's shoulder with his nose, a gentle but insistent reminder that some journeys could not be refused. As the fire died down and the world outside grew cold, Evan realized that the past was no longer content to stay hidden. Something waited in the wilds, a story unfinished, a debt unpaid, and Evan, with Thunder by his side, was the last Malone left to face it. Sleep evaded Evan in the days that followed his discovery of the trunk. Each night, as wind scraped the trees and the fire faded to embers, he lay staring at the cabin's timbered ceiling, the journal's words burning in his mind. The sense of unfinished business pressed in from all sides, and the map, now creased from constant handling, called to him in a way he hadn't expected. The X near the waterfall seemed less a suggestion and more a command, a beacon that grew brighter with each passing day. Evan spent hours pacing the perimeter of the cabin, eyes scanning the horizon, mind drifting between memory and what waited out there in the wild. He'd tell himself to let it go. Why reopen old wounds? Why risk unsettling whatever fragile piece he'd carved for himself? Yet, he knew better than most that the past never stayed buried for long. It had a way of clawing itself back into the present, demanding answers, demanding atonement. Thunder sensed the shift. The Mustang's movements grew alert, purposeful. He hovered close as Evan went about his chores, following him from the woodshed to the creek, gaze fixed and knowing. When Evan paused to study the map by the light of the fading sun, Thunder would come and stand beside him, ears pricked, muscles tense with expectation. One cold morning, the air sharp with the bite of approaching winter, Evan gathered his courage and resolved to act. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it the product of a single moment's clarity. It was the slow gathering of memories, his own and those inherited from Samuel, that finally tipped the scale. There was, in the pages of the journal and the silent urging of Thunder, a promise that could not be ignored. He packed with the practiced efficiency of a soldier. Into his battered rucksack went a canteen, a length of rope, matches, a knife, and enough dried food to last several days. He debated whether to bring Thunder or go alone, not wanting to put the horse at risk, but Thunder would have none of it. The Mustang shadowed his every move, shoving his broad head into the way until Evan relented. It was as if Thunder knew this journey belonged to them both. Before dawn, under a sky glazed with frost, Evan saddled Thunder and checked the cinches with trembling hands. He glanced once at the map, memorizing the route and tracing his grandfather's notes with a finger. The waterfall wasn't marked by any road or trail. He'd have to trust the land, and perhaps more importantly, Thunder's instincts. As they set out, the cabin shrank behind them, its windows dark and watchful. Evan fought the urge to look back, to convince himself this was a fool's errand. Yet for the first time in years, something deeper than fear pulsed through his chest, a cautious hope, sharp as cold water. The world changed as they moved away from the worn paths of routine. Frost-laced grass gave way to dense stands of pine, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and old needles. Evan's boots left prints beside Thunder's hooves, and each step felt like it was pulling him further away from everything safe and known. The forest, beautiful in its quiet threat, seemed to close in around them, every shadow and flicker magnified by nerves. Thunder led the way more than Evan did. The Mustang's ears twitched at sounds Evan could not hear. His steps grew deliberate as they skirted rocky slopes and twisted beneath low-hanging branches. There were moments when the trail all but disappeared, leaving only instinct and the faint guidance of the map. Evan's trust in the Mustang deepened with every mile. Where Evan hesitated, Thunder pressed forward, certain, unwavering. The journey was not without its trials. Evan's body, long unused to such sustained exertion, protested with each hour. His muscles burned, and his breath came in clouds. He was forced to confront the echo of old wounds, the ache in his shoulder from a long-ago shrapnel injury, the limp that flared up in cold weather. Yet Thunder matched his pace, never straying far, always glancing back as if to remind Evan that he was not alone in this trial. Each night, they camped beneath a cold sky, the fire's glow a small defiance against the encroaching dark. Evan would sit, knees drawn to his chest, map and journal laid out in the firelight. He read Samuel's words over and over, letting them settle into the marrow of his bones. The entries blurred at times, Samuel's guilt, his longing to make amends, the hope that someone someday would right his wrongs. Thunder, never far, would settle beside him, muscles twitching as he dozed. Occasionally, the Mustang would wake with a start, head up, nostrils flaring as if sensing something unseen. Evan grew to trust those moments, learning to listen, to let the land and thunder guide him in ways that maps never could. As the days stretched on and the mountains drew nearer, Evan felt the pull of the past intensify. The air grew thinner, the nights colder, the forest wilder. Yet with every step, he felt the possibility of redemption, his own and his grandfather's, take root. It was as if Thunder and the land itself were urging him forward, whispering that some debts could only be paid by courage and trust. And so, beneath the towering pines, in the chill that promised the season's first snow, Evan and Thunder pressed on, two wanderers bound by secrets, hope, and the memory of a promise yet to be fulfilled. The deeper they traveled into Montana's wild heart, the less the world resembled anything Evan had known. The forest pressed in, trees thick and ancient, their moss-draped limbs arching overhead until sunlight became a rare and precious thing. Some days the air was sharp and brittle, full of the promise of snow. Other days clouds sank low and gray, painting the landscape with shadows. The land was rugged, unforgiving, a constant test not just of Evan's body, but of his resolve. Every step of the way, Thunder became more than a companion. He became a guide. At first, Evan thought it was luck, the way the Mustang seemed to find the safest path through tangles of windfall, or paused at the edge of a bog until Evan figured out the ground was soft and treacherous. But after several close calls, Evan realized Thunder was reading the forest in ways no map or journal could teach. The Mustang would freeze, ears pricked, at a faint shift in the breeze or a scatter of pebbles rolling downhill, warning of unstable ground or hidden obstacles. They crossed cold, rushing streams that bit at Evan's calves, their banks slippery with mud and slick with moss. He slipped once, boots skidding out from under him. But Thunder halted beside him, bracing against the current, waiting until Evan regained his footing. Higher up, they navigated scree fields where every stone threatened to tumble loose and send man and horse sliding. The climb was exhausting. Evan's muscles burned, old injuries flared up, and each breath felt like it carried the weight of 100 memories. Storms came out of nowhere, thunder echoing in the canyons, rain slashing through the branches and turning the trails to rivers of mud. The cold seeped into Evan's bones. On one brutal afternoon, as a gray squall rolled down the mountains, a fork of lightning split the sky and sent Thunder into a panic. Evan tried to soothe the horse, but the wind ripped away his words. The Mustang reared, wild-eyed, and Evan lost his grip on the reins. The next thing he knew, he was tumbling down a steep, leaf-littered slope, the world spinning in blurs of green and gray. Pain shot through his ankle as he landed. For a moment, Evan lay sprawled in the muck, cold rain stinging his skin, heart pounding as the memories of Iraq crashed through his mind. Explosions, chaos, the helpless certainty that control was always an illusion. He tried to rise, but his ankle flared with white-hot pain. Frustration and despair welled up inside him, heavier than the storm pressing down. Thunder was gone. The forest was suddenly too large, too empty. Evan's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. A broken ankle, stranded miles from shelter. Wild animals circling in the dark. All at once his old doubts returned, gnawing at him. What made him think he could do this? That he could finish what Samuel started? That he deserved anything but the self-imposed exile he'd built around himself? He dragged himself to the shelter of a boulder, every motion a study in agony and defeat. Cold crept up his legs, soaking into his core. The storm raged on. Evan shivered violently, vision blurring, and for a moment he considered giving up, letting the wild take him, letting the past have the final word. But then, from somewhere in the roaring downpour, he heard the steady clop of hooves. A dark shape emerged through the curtains of rain, thunder, returning, snorting with concern. The Mustang nosed at Evan's shoulder, almost angry, as if berating him for his weakness. Evan pressed his forehead to Thunder's neck, clinging to the familiar warmth, and let the horse's steady presence anchor him to the present. Thunder lowered himself carefully, allowing Evan to haul himself up, grimacing as pain shot through his ankle. Moving slowly, the Mustang carried him to the shelter of a thick spruce, branches woven close enough to block most of the rain. There, protected from the worst of the storm, Evan built a small fire with shaking hands. Thunder stood beside him, a wall against the cold and dark, body trembling with fatigue but eyes clear and determined. The hours crawled by, the storm easing only to return in fresh bursts. Evan wrapped himself in his blanket, pain pulsing with each heartbeat, and watched Thunder doze on his feet, ever alert. He realized in those endless hours that Thunder was more than a survivor. He was a partner, a living reminder that hope and loyalty could exist even in the bleakest circumstances. When the dawn finally broke, silver and cold, Evan felt changed. His ankle throbbed, but he found the strength to stand with Thunder's help. The Mustang waited patiently as Evan braced himself, nudging him toward the remnants of the trail. Together, they moved forward, battered but not broken. Every hardship carved a deeper bond between them. Evan began to trust Thunder's instincts without question, allowing the Mustang to lead when his own sense faltered. He felt the old shell of numbness crack, replaced by a cautious sense of wonder, not just at the wilderness, but at his own capacity to endure, to connect, to heal. They pushed deeper into the wild, the land growing stranger, wilder, and more beautiful with every mile. And through it all, Evan carried not only Samuel's journal and the weight of the past, but also the growing certainty that this journey was remaking him, forging something stronger from the ashes of what he'd been. As the landscape grew more remote and formidable, the world around Evan and Thunder seemed to shrink, reduced to a narrow corridor of survival and persistence. Every day demanded something new, a sharper awareness, a deeper well of endurance, a level of trust that went beyond anything Evan had ever known. The wilds of Montana were relentless, indifferent to human frailty, testing both man and Mustang with every mile. The land itself transformed. The trail climbed steadily into the high country, where the trees thinned and wind howled down from distant snow-dusted peaks. Steep ravines cut through the earth, their slopes slick with loose shale. Icy rivers braided their way through the valleys, running swift and deep after recent storms. The air smelled of pine sap, cold water, and the musk of unseen animals moving just beyond sight. Each obstacle forced Evan to surrender more and more of his judgment to thunder. Crossing swollen rivers, the Mustang would halt at the bank, ears flicking, as if listening to some secret music in the current. When Evan would have chosen a seemingly easier path, thunder nudged him toward the stony shallows, sure-footed and calm even as water surged against their legs. More than once, Evan's doubts nearly got the better of him, but each time he allowed thunder to lead, they emerged safely on the far side. On the mountainside, the trail pinched to a ribbon, barely wider than thunder's hooves, the drop beside them dizzying. Evan's breath caught as pebbles tumbled into the abyss below. Thunder's muscles tightened, every movement precise as he navigated the treacherous pass. The Mustang paused twice, refusing to step forward until Evan trusted his guidance and shifted his weight just so. Afterward, Evan noticed hairline cracks in the rocks where the earth had given way, hidden dangers that thunder had sensed before any human could. Wild animals watched from the shadows, a bear's tracks in the mud, the glint of a cougar's eyes in the twilight, the wary movements of elk ghosting through the pines. At one point, a coyote's sharp yip split the dusk, and thunder froze, then sidestepped the trail, taking them through a thicket that at first seemed impassable. Evan, scratched by branches, grumbled under his breath, until a branch snapped behind them, and a pair of wolfish shapes moved across the path they had just abandoned. Thunder's caution, once again, had saved them. Days passed in this slow, relentless testing. The further they traveled, the more the land felt alive with memory and meaning. Along an overgrown trail, Evan spotted the first of the old tribal markers, a circle of stones arranged with purposeful symmetry, half swallowed by moss. He knelt, brushing aside the debris, and found another symbol carved into a nearby tree, an arrow and a spiral, matching a sketch in Samuel's journal. He pressed his palm to the rough bark, a shiver running through him that was not just from the cold. These markers were proof that his grandfather's stories were not simply the fevered ramblings of a guilty mind. The land itself remembered, holding the scars and secrets of those who had walked it long before him. Thunder stood silent beside him, watching, then pawed the ground softly. The horse's gaze seemed to urge Evan on, deeper into the mystery. Each time they encountered a marker, another pile of stones, a feather tied to a branch, a pattern of sticks, Evan marked it on the map, following not just the drawn path, but the subtle guidance of the Mustang who, again and again, seemed to know where to look. At night, by the small, carefully tended fires, Evan pored over Samuel's journal and the map, trying to fit the pieces together. The entries became more urgent as they neared the waterfall, Samuel's words crowded with remorse and the ache of things undone. There were clues tucked into the margins, descriptions of certain trees, a story of a white stag that guarded the way, a warning to trust the land when all else failed. It became clear to Evan that Thunder was more than just a loyal animal. There was a thread connecting the Mustang to everything Samuel had written and everything the land itself wanted to reveal. At first, Evan resisted the idea. Years of training had taught him to trust reason above intuition. But the wild had its own rules. With every near disaster averted by Thunder's instincts, every hidden danger revealed by a toss of his mane or a stamping hoof, Evan felt his old skepticism crumble. On the 6th day, With the air turning colder and the mountains looming like sentinels, Evan found himself at the edge of a ravine. Mist curled up from below, shrouding the world in mystery. Thunder halted, head up, nostrils wide. Evan glanced at the map and the symbols carved on a nearby stone. Everything pointed forward, toward whatever waited in the veiled wilds. In that moment, Evan understood that he was no longer following a map, nor just fulfilling a dead man's wish. He was moving through a story that belonged to the land, to the people who had been wronged, and to the wild, intuitive creature who had chosen to trust him. As they continued, Evan found himself speaking quietly to Thunder, not in words, but in gestures, in the way he adjusted his grip on the reins, in the silent thanks offered for each danger past. It was trust made visible, as fragile and powerful as the thread that bound them to this journey. Together, man and Mustang pressed on into the unknown, guided by instinct, memory, and the slow, undeniable awakening of hope. After days of following Thunder's lead and deciphering the land's ancient language, the sound reached them, a distant, thunderous roar, muffled by trees and the heavy air of impending snow. Evan's heart leapt, not with joy but a sharp, nervous edge. He had read the word waterfall in Samuel's notes so many times that it felt almost mythical, yet here it was, echoing in the forest, impossible to ignore. The last stretch was the most difficult. The map showed only a vague direction, and the symbols from Samuel's journal became scarcer as the terrain grew wilder. Evan's ankle, still sore from his fall days before, throbbed with every step, but the sense of nearness overpowered his fatigue. The landscape pitched and rolled, slopes tangled with deadfall and slippery rocks, and at times the mist grew so dense that he could hardly see Thunder's black shape ahead. But the Mustang pressed on, undaunted, occasionally pausing to check the ground or lift his nose to the breeze. As the sound of the water grew, so did the sense of anticipation. Evan felt as if the forest itself held its breath. A final steep descent brought them into a narrow gorge where the roar became overwhelming, bouncing off the stone walls and filling the world with vibration. Thunder hesitated at the edge of a stream, stamping and tossing his head as the water churned white over hidden rocks. Evan steadied him, their connection now as much about silent reassurance as command. They rounded a mossy outcrop, and the falls appeared, tall, wild, and fierce, throwing spray into the air in a cloud of rainbows and mist. Evan stood for a long moment, letting the shock of beauty and force wash over him. He looked to Thunder, who was watching the falls intently, ears flicking, muscles tense beneath his dark coat. There was something in the way the Mustang regarded the place, a mixture of awe and recognition, as if he too understood that this was the destination, written not just in the journal, but in the bones of the land itself. Evan surveyed the scene, searching for anything that might resemble a path. The map suggested there was more than met the eye. He scanned the rock face to the right of the falls, looking for the narrow trail Samuel had described in the margins of his journal, a dangerous, slippery passage behind the curtain of water. With Thunder beside him, he moved closer, boots skidding on the slick, algae-clad stones. The roar of the water was deafening, each drop a hammer against his battered senses. A faint trail revealed itself, a strip of dirt and stone pressed into the cliff by time and the passage of generations. Thunder refused to wait behind. As Evan edged his way along the path, the Mustang followed, hooves clinging to impossible footing, his calm an anchor against the dizzying drop below. Midway along the ledge, the mist thickened, blurring the world to nothing but sound and sensation. Evan's foot slipped, his body pitching sideways. A jolt of panic tore through him. He scrabbled for purchase, heart racing. In that split second, Thunder's body pressed against him, blocking his fall, bracing him with sheer force and instinct. Evan found his balance, chest heaving, and pressed a shaking hand to the Mustang's wet mane. They lingered there, breathless, until he could move again. On the far side of the falls, half hidden by ferns and dripping stone, was a narrow crevice, an opening just wide enough for a man and a horse to squeeze through. Evan ducked inside, pulling Thunder after him. The noise from the falls faded, replaced by a deeper silence, damp and electric. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of earth and something older, a mingling of mineral, wood smoke, and secrets. They found themselves in a cave, its walls gleaming with dampness, the darkness thick as velvet. Evan fumbled for his flashlight, its beam slicing the shadows. His breath fogged before him as he advanced, Thunder's hoofbeats echoing in the hollow space. Against the far wall, hidden behind a tumble of loose stones, lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Evan's hands shook as he uncovered it. Inside were sacred artifacts, beads carved from bone, a pipe inlaid with turquoise, feathers bound in intricate patterns. And nestled among these treasures was a small figurine, carved from obsidian in the shape of a Mustang mid-gallop. The figure caught the light, its surface glinting with a dark brilliance that seemed almost alive. Beneath the bundle was a letter, the paper brittle with age, but the handwriting unmistakably Samuel's. Evan unfolded it, reading by the trembling glow of the flashlight. The words were simple, almost pleading, a confession of guilt, an admission of wrongs done and rights denied, and a final request for forgiveness. Samuel's grief for the tribe he'd helped displace was raw on the page. He begged whoever found the letter to honor the truth, to restore what had been taken, and to bring peace to the spirits, both living and dead, who remained bound to this hidden place. Evan sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd found. Thunder stood silent at his side, eyes reflecting the beam of the flashlight, as if understanding the importance of this moment. The past had spoken, not in the language of ghosts, but in the touch of stone and the whisper of water. As he gathered the artifacts and the letter, Evan felt the crushing weight of his family's history pressing down, but also the possibility of release. The secrets were no longer hidden. The journey was only halfway done, but the hardest truths had at last seen the light. And in the quiet dark, beneath the roar of the ancient falls, man and Mustang stood together, not just as survivors, but as keepers of a promise that would change them both forever. The hidden cave's silence pressed in on Evan as he knelt in the weak beam of his flashlight, surrounded by artifacts that whispered of loss and centuries-old pain. For a long moment, he could only stare at the bundle in his hands, the beads, the pipe, the feathers, and the obsidian Mustang whose black sheen shimmered in the uncertain light. Each piece pulsed with a weight that went far beyond their material worth. But as the hours slipped by and exhaustion set in, another, less noble feeling began to creep over him. Evan was no stranger to hardship. The modest disability checks, the odd jobs in town, the cold that seeped into his cabin when the woodpile ran low. Every month was a negotiation with scarcity. His grandfather's old debts, too, seemed to echo through generations, demanding payment in ways that never ended. Here, in the dim silence of the cave, the artifacts offered a temptation sharper than any he'd ever known. Their beauty, their age, he knew what such treasures might bring at auction, knew how many of his problems could be solved if he chose the easier road. Just one sale, and he'd never have to worry again. The thought slithered through his mind, hissing its logic, building its case. He tried to picture a different future, one where he walked out of the woods with Thunder and started fresh somewhere warm, far from this burden of memory and regret. As if sensing the shift, Thunder moved closer, breath misting in the cold, his steady gaze unblinking in the glow of the flashlight. For a moment, Evan couldn't look at the Mustang. He turned the obsidian figurine over in his hands, its edges worn smooth by time and touch. Thunder nickered quietly, his massive head nearly brushing Evan's shoulder, as if to anchor him in the present. The Mustang's eyes held no judgment, only trust, unwavering and silent. That trust was a gift Evan had never truly felt he deserved. It was a reminder that even a wounded soul could be loved. Even a lost man could be followed. The guilt returned, heavier than before. He thought of the journal entries, Samuel's trembling confession, the grief etched into every word, the plea for forgiveness not just from the tribe, but from all those who might come after. He remembered the stories Samuel had never told, the secrets buried in the land and the broken promises left behind. And then he remembered the day he had rescued Thunder, the Mustang, wild and terrified, eyes rolling white, and how Evan's patience and quiet had been the only thing to reach him. Loyalty for loyalty, trust for trust. The temptation did not vanish. It lingered, seductive and practical. Evan's hands trembled as he wrapped the figurine back in its cloth, then placed it gently atop the other artifacts. He forced himself to sit in the dark and truly consider what he owed, to himself, to Samuel's memory, and most of all, to the people who had lost so much at the hands of men like his grandfather. Thunder's breathing filled the cave, slow and certain. Evan let the sound center him, recalling every time the Mustang had pulled him back from despair, every moment Thunder had sensed danger before it struck. Every night his quiet presence had steadied Evan's racing heart. In Thunder's eyes, Evan saw the silent demand to do better, not just for himself, but for all those who had been denied justice for so long. He picked up Samuel's letter once more. The final lines, written in shaky, desperate script, pleaded for the finder to return what was taken and make it right. Evan bowed his head, the old wounds in his heart aching with the knowledge that the right thing was rarely the easy thing. He could not buy his way out of history. He could not escape what his family had done or what he had endured. But he could choose not to add to the pain. He could choose to heal instead of harm. With a trembling breath, Evan made his decision. The artifacts would not be sold, would not vanish into the world of collectors and glass cases. They would go back to those who had lost them, back to the people who remembered the land not just as property, but as home. He owed that to the past, to Thunder, to himself. A quiet peace stole over him as he stood, stiff and sore, wrapping the bundle with care. Thunder watched, a silent sentinel, understanding more than any human ever could. The way forward was uncertain. He knew the tribe might not trust him, might reject his attempt at restitution. But the burden he had carried for so long felt lighter. He was not the sum of his scars or his family's shame. He was the man who could choose, and in choosing, begin to break the cycle. With the artifacts secured and Samuel's letter clutched in his hand, Evan stepped out of the cave into the faint gray light before dawn, Thunder following close behind. The waterfall roared behind them, unchanged by the night's revelation, as old and implacable as the truth. But within Evan, something fundamental had shifted, a resolve born of pain and hope, of memory and forgiveness. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, Evan walked toward the future, not as a fugitive from the past, but as its keeper and its witness. The descent from the hidden cave was nothing like the way up. The air felt thinner, and every muscle in Evan's body trembled with the aftershock of decision. The world below seemed sharper now, its colors brighter and colder. With the sacred bundle wrapped in oilcloth and Samuel's confession pressed against his chest, he felt as if he carried not just a family's secret, but the burden of 100 years' worth of wrongs on his shoulders. Thunder was quiet and steady on the trail, the Mustang's hoofbeats the only sound in the early morning hush. Evan did not know how he would be received. He had no claim, no right, only the hope that honesty and intention could open a door that history had slammed shut. As they moved out of the shadowed woods and back into the world of roads and telephone lines, Evan rehearsed what he might say, every imagined version breaking apart in his mind before it could take shape. The town's tribal council building sat at the edge of the reservation, a low, cedar-sided structure with sun-bleached murals on its walls. Evan's heart hammered as he tied Thunder's reins and approached the doors, the bundle held close. He paused, glancing at Thunder, who met his eyes with the same calm steadiness that had carried them through the wild. It was enough to move his feet forward. Inside, the smell of coffee and old paper lingered. The council room was small and utilitarian, dominated by a round table. The elders, 3 women and 2 men, their faces marked by time and memory, sat in a circle, their eyes unreadable as Evan entered. He felt their gaze, not hostile but cautious, weighing every movement, every word. He introduced himself in a voice that felt foreign, hollowed out by nerves and exhaustion. He spoke of the Malone land, his grandfather Samuel, the journal, the map, the journey to the falls, and the things he had found hidden in the earth. He placed the bundle on the table and set Samuel's letter beside it. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the far wall and the distant shuffle of Thunder's hooves outside. The silence stretched. One elder, a tall man with braids and sharp eyes, finally leaned forward. His voice was quiet, roughened by years. Why bring this now? Why not keep it hidden like everyone else? Evan's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands, scarred and shaking. The truth, simple and unsparing, was all he had left. I can't change the past, but I can refuse to carry its lies any longer. I wanted you to know. I want to do what's right. There was a rustle as the council opened the bundle, revealing the artifacts and the obsidian Mustang. Recognition flickered in their eyes, a shared understanding that transcended language. One elder whispered to another in Salish, and Evan caught only the emotion behind the words. Sorrow, relief, awe. Yet suspicion lingered, heavy in the room. The council debated in low voices, asking questions about Samuel, about the exact location of the cave, about how Evan had come by the journal and why he had not gone to the authorities or the press. Each answer was weighed, cross-examined, turned over like a stone in the hand. The pain of the past was fresh for them, as present as the land itself. When Evan described Thunder's role in the journey, how the Mustang had guided him, recognized the markers, refused to let him quit, one of the elders, an elderly woman with silver hair and a gaze that cut through pretense, asked to see the horse. Evan led her outside. The rest followed, their voices hushed. Thunder stood in the morning light, coat still streaked with mud and sweat. his presence proud and unbroken. The elders circled him, murmuring quietly. One reached out, touching Thunder's shoulder, tracing the faint patterns of scars and the bold swirl on his forehead. She turned to the others and said something in her language, her voice trembling with emotion. Later, Evan would learn that Thunder bore markings unique to a line of Mustangs once cherished by the tribe, descendants of horses that had been driven off or lost during the forced relocations. Thunder's very bloodline was living proof of a connection severed but never erased. The elders' suspicion softened, replaced by something closer to reverence and hope. Back inside, the council's tone changed. They questioned Evan about his intentions, whether he would allow the artifacts to be returned in a public ceremony, whether he would allow his grandfather's letter to be included in the tribe's archives. Evan agreed without hesitation. There was no legacy left for him except what could be made right. A plan was shaped in careful, solemn words. The artifacts would be returned, not as a quiet transaction, but as part of a gathering where the tribe could reclaim what was lost, bear witness, and share their own stories. Evan would be welcome to attend, not as a savior, but as a participant in the long, slow work of healing. Thunder, too, would be honored, his story woven into the ceremony as a living bridge between what was taken and what might be restored. As Evan left the council building, the sun climbing over the mountains, he felt relief and fear tangled together. A new uncertainty, but also, for the first time in years, a sense of possibility. He had faced the past and not been destroyed by it. As Thunder walked beside him, the Mustang's presence warm and steady, Evan knew there was still much to atone for. But the future, fragile, uncertain, and unfinished, was finally open. The day of the ceremony dawned clear and cold, Montana's early light painting the mountains in bands of rose and gold. Evan stood outside the tribal council building with Thunder, feeling exposed beneath the sky's infinite blue. The bundle of artifacts, now rewrapped in new cloth by the elders' careful hands, rested in his arms. Every step he'd taken since finding the trunk had led to this moment, one that belonged as much to the tribe as to his family's legacy. The elders arrived in procession, dressed in layers that blended practical warmth and quiet dignity. Children trailed after them, whispering and wide-eyed. The community gathered in small groups, some with faces drawn by memory, others with hope flickering in their eyes. Evan kept to the edge, Thunder close, his heart thudding not from fear, but from awe at what he was being allowed to witness. They traveled together from the council house to the trailhead, following a path into the forest that wound toward the hidden waterfall. The elders led with the artifacts and a bundle of sage burning, the smoke curling into the morning air, trailing the prayers of the people. Thunder walked between Evan and the procession, head held high, hooves silent on the carpet of pine needles. The journey to the cave felt different than before, no longer a desperate search, but a walk of purpose and release. Along the way, the elders shared stories in low, steady voices. They spoke of the land before the settlements and barbed wire, before treaties broken and promises forgotten. They spoke of horses, Mustangs whose spirits ran wild and free, whose endurance and loyalty mirrored that of the people themselves. Evan listened in silence, letting their words settle into him like the slow, healing heat of a fire. At the base of the falls, the air shimmered with spray and sunlight. The roar was less menacing now, more like a heartbeat pulsing through the stone. The elders formed a circle, motioning Evan and Thunder to the center. The bundle was placed on a flat rock, and the tribe's oldest member stepped forward, his hands trembling only slightly as he began the ritual. He spoke in Salish, his words rising and falling with the rhythm of the falls, and the people answered, their voices merging into a tapestry of sound. Sage was burned, its scent strong and cleansing. The elders removed the artifacts from their wrappings, holding them aloft one by one. A bone bead, a feather, the pipe, the obsidian Mustang, so all could see what had been hidden for so long. As each item was revealed, stories followed. The pipe belonged to a chief who had made peace with rivals under the shadow of those very falls. The bone beads had been worn by a grandmother who survived a winter famine and taught her family the stories of the stars. The obsidian Mustang, carved by a long-dead artist, was once given to the tribe as a promise that horses would always run free on their lands. The stories were not told as accusations, but as testaments of resilience, survival, and memory. Thunder stood utterly still as the elders approached him, laying their hands gently on his flanks and neck, murmuring words of thanks and welcome. One by one, children were allowed to come forward, pressing their small palms to Thunder's side. Evan saw their awe, the way they looked at Thunder not just as an animal, but as a living bridge to their ancestors. The ceremony grew, woven through with song and prayer, drums rising and falling in tempo with the water's rush. Evan felt something inside him loosen, a pressure that had built over years, suddenly released in the collective breath of the people gathered there. His grandfather's letter was read aloud, the words trembling in the mountain air. As the elders translated Samuel's plea for forgiveness, Evan felt the weight of shame lift, not entirely, but enough to let gratitude and humility fill its place. The tribe's storyteller, an elderly woman whose voice carried through the gorge, stood and spoke of cycles, how pain could run through generations, but so could healing if someone dared to stop running from the truth. She looked at Evan and Thunder not as outsiders, but as witnesses to the long, difficult work of making amends. She spoke of the Mustangs, how Thunder's bloodline had survived exile and hardship, a living sign that nothing was truly lost if it was cherished and remembered. As the sun climbed, the people feasted on food brought from home. Laughter mingled with tears, and for a time, old wounds faded into the background. Children wove flowers into Thunder's mane. Elders offered Evan quiet nods, acknowledging not just his actions, but his willingness to bear witness. No one called him a hero, and no one needed to. The act of returning what had been lost, of speaking the truth and honoring the pain, was enough. When the final prayers were spoken and the smoke from the sage drifted away on the wind, Evan felt different. Lighter, yes, but also deeply anchored, part of something that had existed long before him and would endure long after. Thunder stood by his side, the Mustang's presence a reminder that redemption was never a single act, but a journey that demanded courage, humility, and the willingness to face the past. Again and again. As the community packed up and began the slow walk home, Evan lingered at the edge of the clearing, Thunder at his shoulder. The sound of the waterfall faded, but the stories, the gratitude, and the new bonds formed that day would remain, echoing through the land and the people who called it home. After the ceremony, the world did not change overnight. The sharpness of winter crept over the land, blanketing Montana in frost and quiet. But something inside Evan was unmistakably different. For years, he had lived with the sense that he was unfinished, a man defined by wounds, haunted by ghosts, bound to the shadows of memory and regret. Now, walking back through the forest with Thunder, he felt the edges of those shadows softening. The past was still there, but it no longer pressed so heavily on his every breath. The return to his cabin was not a retreat, but a homecoming. Evan swept out the old wood smoke, let the daylight in, and found new purpose in the familiar routines. Thunder, too, seemed changed. The Mustang's step was lighter, his eyes brighter, as if he sensed not just the relief in Evan, but his own importance in what had passed. They were no longer just survivors clinging to the wild's edge, but partners who had weathered something ancient and unspoken together. As word of the ceremony spread, people began to visit Evan's cabin. At first, it was just the elders, bringing him bread or gifts, asking to hear his account of the journey and see the journal that had changed so much. They stayed for tea, their stories filling the little house with laughter and the warmth of shared experience. Then came the children, curious, bursting with questions about Thunder, eager to hear the story of the Mustang who had led a man through the forest to right an old wrong. It was the children who brought the greatest change. They asked to ride Thunder, to brush his coat, to learn how to move quietly through the woods. Their joy was contagious. Evan found himself teaching them what he knew, not just about horses, but about listening, about patience, about honoring the land and its history. In sharing these lessons, he rediscovered a part of himself he thought he'd lost in the desert, in the old wars, in the endless silence of his own mind. Soon, veterans from nearby towns heard about Evan's story. Men and women, some young and others weathered by battle, made the trek out to his cabin. They came seeking advice, or just a place to sit by the fire and say nothing. Evan recognized the haunted look in their eyes, the way their hands fidgeted when conversation grew too personal. He did not offer cures or easy answers, but instead shared Thunder's story, how trust and loyalty could grow even in broken places, how journeys sometimes led to healing even when you weren't looking for it. A few of the veterans asked if they could help. Together, they mended fences, cleared brush, and built a new stable for Thunder. It was hard work, but good work, the kind that left you tired in body but easy in spirit. By spring, the old cabin had become a gathering place. Evenings found it filled with laughter, the scent of baking bread, and the low murmur of voices sharing burdens too heavy to carry alone. The tribal elders returned as well, bringing not only stories, but ceremony. They invited Evan to take part in their seasonal gatherings, where he listened and learned more about the land his family had once called theirs, and the pain woven through every acre. With their blessing, he began teaching the children of both the tribe and local townsfolk, sharing horsemanship and history, telling the story of the obsidian Mustang and the courage it took to bring the past into the light. Thunder, too, became a legend. Children wrote his name in their schoolwork. Artists painted him racing through fields of wildflowers, his mane catching the wind. Visitors came just to see him, sometimes offering apples, sometimes only a quiet moment in his presence. Thunder was honored not just as a remarkable animal, but as a living link between worlds that had once been torn apart. In the way he allowed strangers to brush his coat or rested his head in a child's arms, there was a message of forgiveness and renewal no words could match. Evan no longer hid from the world. On early mornings, he rode out with Thunder into the rising light, following the trails they had once taken in fear and pain, now tracing them in hope. Sometimes he would pause at the creek, watching the sunlight flicker on the water and listening to the wind in the pines. The ache in his heart had not vanished, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the voices of friends, the laughter of children, and the steady presence of the horse who had carried him back from the brink. The cabin that was once a refuge for one broken soul became a sanctuary for many, a place where wounds could be spoken of and seen, where burdens could be shared, and sometimes, slowly, set down. The memory of Samuel Malone lingered, no longer a specter, but a lesson, one that Evan honored with every story he told and every kindness he offered. As another year turned, the valley bloomed with wildflowers and the mountains stood eternal in the background. One morning, as the sky brightened with the promise of a new day, Evan saddled Thunder and rode out, the world quiet and full of possibility. The scars he bore were part of his story, but so was his healing. The Mustang beneath him, once a symbol of all that was wild and untamable, was now the heartbeat of his new life, a reminder that even the deepest wounds can yield to hope and connection. Together, man and horse moved forward, leaving behind not their past, but the fear that the past would be all they ever were. In the soft dawn light, with the world awake around them, Evan and Thunder rode into the future, whole at last, and utterly free.